With that, let us focus our attention to Brother Adam.
Good morning. I have a bone to pick with every one of you today. I've got some issue that's going on with every single person today. And I need to know how to resolve this issue with every single one of you. Now, what that problem is, that conflict, I'm not going to say. And maybe it's for you to figure out. Maybe we'll get to it later on this exhortation. But I've got a problem with every single one of you, and I need to learn how to resolve it. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So what is conflict? So the title is Resolving Conflict. So what is conflict? Conflict is having a disagreement or a struggle against an opposing viewpoint, an opposing need. So if I want something and someone else wants something else, then we have a conflict of interest. And conflict can be perceived from one person, like I can think I have a conflict with all of you, and that would be considered a conflict with me, or it can be perceived from all parties. I have an issue with you, you guys have an issue with me, we have conflict. So there's two different types of conflict that we can have. Whether the other person knows that we have an issue with them, that disagreement, that struggle with them, or they don't. But then that also begs the question, is all conflict bad between each other? Yes? No? Is all conflict bad? No. Okay, why not? Can you give an example of why all conflict would not be bad? Without conflict, you don't reach a resolution? What was that, Sister Uni? Did you have something? Sister Uni? No. That's okay, that's okay. I heard that you said something, but I'm sure that the wisdom was there for at least you to embrace right there. Yeah, it does fit differently with that. And kind of like what Michael was saying, that you do need constructive conflict to lead for new ideas that can lead for a resolution. Example kind of that I was thinking of, I work in the health food industry, and there are a lot of like food sensitive people that will come into our stores. So we've got all sorts of selections of like gluten-free offerings. But if you go to another restaurant, maybe they don't necessarily have that gluten-free option for you. So you can have that type of conflict. Well, it is a very small scale, but saying, oh, I can't necessarily eat this. The restaurant saying, we don't serve this. So because that conflict, what can happen is them going on their menu and creating those gluten-free alternatives. So having that type of conflict between two parties, that disagreement between what I can eat and what you can provide, and leading that to a new resolution. And so the idea of conflict, and especially resolving it, because I know my dad always asked me, where do I get the inspiration for these talks? So recently, I had taken a test regarding my conflict resolution styles. And in my opinion, I failed. So I failed to resolve conflict. And the way that I failed is because there are 5 different styles of resolving conflict. There is aversion, there is accommodating, compromising, competing, and collaborating. So 5 different styles of resolving conflict. And in my mind, when I was kind of taking through the results, and I figured that, okay, collaborating is considered the best form of resolving conflict, working together with someone else to resolve that conflict. And then when I looked at the results, I found I was in the 7th percentile. So very low on that scale of actually collaborating with someone else to resolve that type of conflict. But what I found that I'm really good at is aversion. I'm actually in the 95th percentile of conflict aversion. Of just, if conflict happens, I run away from it. I run, I hide, I don't want anything to do with it. And I think I'm pretty good at that. Like being able to get away with not doing that. My senior year of college, this is my favorite example of avoiding conflict. one of my roommates, I was having a little bit of a disagreement with kind of the way that, he was kind of, that he was taking care of himself, his actions, a little bit, the words he was saying. I was getting a little bit frustrated at him. But me being conflict averse, I didn't say anything to him, didn't do anything to him. They sent us home for spring break. COVID happened, never saw him again. So it worked out for me. That type of conflict aversion, it worked out for me. But that's not necessarily the biblical way that we want to resolve conflict. We don't want to run and hide anytime we're faced with a difficult decision. So that's something where that collaborating aspect, working together to solve it, and me realizing that, hey, I failed this, I'm very low on the scale, what can I do to improve that? And so I want to give a little bit of a tip for you guys. If an exhorter also happens to the piano, it's also pretty good to pay attention to the hymns, because we're actually going to go through the hymn that we just sung a little bit and kind of how that relates to conflict resolution. So keep your Bible in one hand, keep the hymn book open to 341 on the other hand. But just a little note, because that hymn, when I was going through, picking them out, realized it really has good steps for resolving conflict. Because as Christians, are we instructed to avoid all conflict? Are we supposed to, if conflict happens, do we avoid it? Do we want that averse side? Yes? No? No. If conflict comes, we're supposed to be there. And like in the first verse of the Green Book 341, if you look at the second, or kind of the third line, it says, "Can it be a question whether brethren should from conflict cease?" And that's kind of a fancy way of saying kind of that question. Should brethren avoid conflict? Should from conflict cease, also known as like stop conflict. Because conflict is unavoidable in everything that we do. From large scale to small scale, from something at work, when you're trying to schedule meetings with someone else, you have a conflict of time. People are busy at a certain time of the day. They're only available for this one time, but I'm not available. We have that time conflict. If I'm with a bunch of people and we're deciding what to do, I want to go play basketball. They want to go play soccer. Someone else wants to go shopping. We have a conflict of interest. And in the end, it'll likely work itself out. But in that time, we have that conflict right there. So we need to know how to resolve that type of conflict in that collaborating aspect, working together to resolve it, and which leads to unity. Again, in the Green Book 341, the second part, right after brethren should from conflict cease, says, "'Tis in union, and how do we do it? Hope and joy and love increase." So that little bit of that preview of hope, joy, and love, that's how we get towards that unity of resolving that conflict. But now going over to the Bible also has a formula for resolving conflict. And it's in Matthew 18, from 15 to 18. So that's Matthew 18, starting at verse 15, going to 18. "If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So we've got this formula right here. And in particular, this is a formula for someone that you're very close with, your brother, per se. So if you have that issue, you go and talk to them directly, one-on-one. You resolve it right there. And if they're still refusing to listen, then you get some other people kind of as that evidence, that proof behind you. And if that still doesn't work, then you take them to a selection of people, essentially the church, an authority which most people would listen to, the collective agreements from the church. And if they still don't listen, after all that time, that conflict is still there, then it's time to kind of disregard them. So going from brothers to treating them as a pagan, as an outcast. But you have to go through each one of these steps. You don't want to skip, okay, I have that issue with you, but I'm going to go tell everyone behind your back. No, you want to go and confront them right away, because that's how Jesus instructs us, dealing with that sin, that type of conflict you can have with one another. And when we think about ourselves, when we're faced with conflict, is that we have three options that we can do when we're trying to talk one-on-one with another person. We can escape the conflict situation, something which I'm very familiar with doing, running away, being averse. We can attack. We can point lots of fingers at them, saying, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, but not necessarily listening to that resolution. Or the third option is we can make peace with the situation. We can learn from each other and work together towards a common understanding to make peace. But the stance we take is often fueled by our own self-interest. We don't often think about the other person's side when we're in a conflict with them. I want to turn to James 4, the first two verses, that talks about this aspect of thinking of ourselves first. So that's James 4, verses 1 and 2. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire, but do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have, because you do not ask God. Our interests, they are fueled by ourselves. Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? From ourselves is why a lot of times we may have a hidden agenda when we're in conflict with someone else, where we really want to get to point X, when the best solution is actually get to point Y. And instead of thinking about ourselves, and it's an easy thing in theory, but harder in practice, is to actually consider their perspective, to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, to really understand the situation. And once you understand that situation, you can achieve a better formula for resolving that conflict. And so it's cool going back to the hymn of 341, this time in the second verse. It says, it behooves us each to bear a brother's load. When you're thinking about your brother, your brethren, your sisters, those that are close to you, when you think about them, their situation, instead of point the fingers, instead of thinking of ourselves, but to also help them carry that load, to think about them and their situation, what they are looking for, what they're needing. And then if you go to the next verse for hymn 341, goes for a little bit at the beginning. When we think how much our Father has forgiven and does forgive, because the biggest thing in conflict resolution is forgiveness. And it may be hard for us to imagine that type of forgiveness, but our Father has forgiven us for all of our sins. And it is our duty to forgive just as He forgave us. So I want to turn to Colossians 3, verses 12 to 14. That's Colossians 3, verses 12 to 14, talking about this forgiveness. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in a perfect unity. These are the attributes that we need to have when resolving an issue. It's compassion, kindness, humility, lowering ourselves, gentleness, patience. Resolving conflict doesn't happen right away. It takes time. You have to be patient. But it's all that forgiveness that's truly, in the end, that if we don't have that virtue of forgiveness, of willing to forgive someone, or willing to forgive ourselves for that type of conflict, just as Lord forgave us, then we'll never resolve that type of conflict we have with each other. And then we also skipping back over to the Green Book, and still in that third verse, talking about that forgiveness and what we want to remove ourselves of. It says, far removing all that might offend or grieve. So to try and eliminate those options which cause us to quarrel with each other. Again, something in theory which is a lot easier said than done, but eliminating options, especially if you know your person, if the person's your brother, you generally have a good idea of how they work, what things they like, what things they don't like. And if you know something that's going to upset them, then you don't talk about it, especially someone that you're close with. I'm going to turn to 1 Peter 3, verses 9 to 11, talking more about this, of understanding those around you. That's 1 Peter 3, from verse 9 to 11. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insults. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. So if someone wrongs us, in the Old Testament it says an eye for an eye. But this New Testament, where we're learning about what Jesus would say, it's do not repay evil with evil. If someone wrongs you, we don't wrong them back. We don't want to retaliate. Instead, we want to work together and treat them well. We want to treat them good. Repay evil with good. Because with conflict resolution, the goal is to fix the problem and not the blame. So let's say, for instance, we have a couple kids that are fighting over a toy, and they want to, one kid wants the toy, the other kid wants it. How do they resolve this type of conflict with each other? And it's easy to say, you have the toy, give it to me. Point the fingers and saying, all right, I'm blaming you because I want it. But that's not the type of mentality that should be happening when it goes to resolving that. The problem is there's a toy, two kids want to play with it, so what's the solution? How do we fix that problem instead of saying, you got this, be happy? Instead of pointing fingers, it's fixing that problem. Maybe having a type of collaborating session where, okay, you can play with the toy for 5 minutes, I'll play with another toy for 5 minutes, then we'll switch. Something like that, where you're working together and achieving a common ground understanding where both parties will be happy in the end. Where it's focused on that reconciliation. Because in conflict, a lot of times you have a winner and a loser when resolving it. And our job as Christians is to have two winners in our conflicts with our brethren. We don't want, if I have an issue with someone in the church, I don't want to put them down just to lower myself up. I want it so that way both of us are happy and that we can reconcile with each other instead of focusing so much on the solution of the solution that I'm right, you're wrong, but working together so that way we're both happy in the end, and that we can both have a more godly spirit afterwards. Because we can have loving relationships with each other without agreeing on everything. If we agreed on everything, no friction, no conflict, it's boring and you won't ever get anything accomplished. Because there needs to be some pushback to really to increase each one of us, our understanding of the Bible, our understanding of each other, and really our understanding of the world. We need to have that pushback from people that we especially trust. And we need to build each other up rather than ourselves. It's easier for me to push everyone down, to focus on myself, but our goal needs to build each other up, including myself. And that was another issue that I would have when I was taking my conflict resolution test. My ability to compromise, or really to settle for less than I should have, I was also in the 75th percentile. I was pretty high up on that. So I was more willing to settle, to lower myself, to raise someone else up. But that's not the best way of collaborating. We need to focus on building each other up, ourselves included, so that we can all be better. As it says in the hymn, so this time going on the 4th verse, it says, "Then let each esteem his brother better than himself to be," saying to put our brethren first, to focus on those other than ourselves, which can be such a difficult thing to do, to put someone before ourselves. In this era of self-interest, of wanting to push ourselves first, it's difficult to do. That's where you need that mental fortitude to stick to something, to really consider the long-term outcome, the long-term relationship that you're going to have with this other person. And is it going to be positive? Is it going to be negative? And so, in concluding, no matter what we do, we are going to have conflict in our lives. It can be small, it can be trivial, whether deciding, where to go out to eat and arguing over that, or it can be a lot bigger, maybe it's a married couple talking about having kids, or deciding whether to move from point A to point B. There can be all sorts of conflict right there, but we need to think about resolving it in that healthy and spiritual way, thinking as the Bible has laid out for us, that we don't want to push each other down, we want to build each other up, and we need to have the thoughts of forgiveness as the Lord has forgiven us, where if we're wrong, we hope that the other person can forgive us, and if they're wrong, we need to be able to forgive them as well. We need to view the perspective of the other person, to consider their shoes and what they're actually going through right now. Is this a better situation for them right now compared to me? Am I in the position right now where I don't need to win, but I can see the other person's side situation, putting them before ourselves. I want to wrap up by, again, reading, this time really reading and getting into the words of hymn 341, the last verse, and letting this stick with you with resolving conflict. "Then let each esteem his brother better than himself to be, and let each prefer another, full of love, from envy free. Happy are we, when in this we all agree."